In recent years, a lot of things have gotten expensive. With that in mind, and unfortunately, older Pokemon games are no exception. Specifically Generation 1 to Generation 5. Today, I would like to discuss why Pokemon games are as expensive as they are, what to do if you want to get your hands on these games, and what it will look like for these games as time passes. Let's talk about pricing first. Loose cartridges of these games alone have reached crazy prices beyond what they retailed for. It's not unreasonable to see a loose copy of Pokemon Crystal going for $100 to $125, or Pokemon Fire Red going from somewhere between $90 to $110. Keep in mind these games retailed for something around $30 to $40, so we are talking about at least a 200% markup if not higher. And note that we are talking about loose copies. No box, no manual. In fact, at a local retro game store nearby where I live, they had just the big box for Pokemon Soul Silver going for $70. Just the box. No game or anything else. To say that pricing for these games has gotten out of hand would be a major understatement. To really break down how it got to this is actually very simple, as it falls in the concept of supply and demand. The demand for these games is through the roof while the supply is limited and will become more limited as time passes. One factor on the demand side of things is that mainline Pokemon games have been absolute hot trash for nearly a decade now. I would argue it all started in 2016 with Pokemon Sun and Moon. Pokemon Sun and Moon felt like a poor imitation of Pokemon rather than actual Pokemon. But that is a story for another day. The point I'm trying to drive home is that although recent games have seen commercial success, the general fan base has noticed and has been very vocal about the drastic dip in quality of these games. Unfortunately, their voices fall on deaf ears, as the games will sell regardless of quality, and these same fans that complain buy the games anyways. As a result of this notoriety that recent Pokemon games have of being flat out bad, it has surged a strong interest in the older games. Essentially a sense of nostalgia for the good old days, if you will. As previously stated, for longtime fans, the desire to buy the older games comes from nostalgia and revisiting Pokemon when it was still good. Chances are, as a child, you likely got one version but not the other, Ruby but not Sapphire, Diamond but not Pearl, and so on and so forth. I can see a lot of older fans wanting to buy the versions that they didn't have growing up. That for sure includes me. However, we also can't dismiss the idea of new fans and the younger generation of kids wanting to play these games as well. As bad as Pokemon Scarlet Violet, Sword Shield, and Sun Moon are, they are still the first Pokemon adventure for a lot of kids, making it essentially their gateway game. I'm sure quite a few of the kids these days have taken a look at Pokemon games from the past and have wanted to maybe play those games. For them, however, it is likely impossible due to the absurd cost of buying these games secondhand. It's a shame. They will never get to see Pokemon at its peak and prime. It also hasn't helped that these games can only be obtained physically, as purchasing digital copies of them is not possible. A lot of them never were really being sold digitally to begin with, other than Pokemon Red, Blue, Yellow, Gold, Silver, and Crystal thanks to the 3DS eShop. 3DS eShop, however, has now permanently closed, so there goes that. What's crazy to note here is that the most popular selling games in the last week on the 3DS eShop prior to closure on March 27, 2023 were all of these aforementioned Pokemon games. I personally made an initiative to get Pokemon Crystal and Pokemon Yellow myself. If this doesn't cement just how insane the demand for these games are, then I honestly don't know what does. As you can see, the supply for these games has now gotten even lower, which will only naturally further drive up the demand. With the 3DS eShop closure in mind, there are another set of mainline Pokemon games that have not surged up in price just yet, but likely will. I am specifically talking about the Generation 6 mainline Pokemon games, which would be Pokemon X, Y, Omega Ruby, and Alpha Sapphire. It isn't too hard to find a complete in-box copy of these games for generally around what they retailed for at launch, but that will likely change very soon. If you want the Generation 6 Pokemon games, get them now while they're affordable. Frankly, in my opinion, Generation 6 was the last good generation of Pokemon, with X and Y being good, but lackluster games similar to Diamond and Pearl, and Omega Ruby Alpha Sapphire being the definitive way to have a Pokemon adventure in the Hoenn region. It just simply doesn't get better than that. In a broader sense, and because of the direction that video games and physical media are going in general, retro games as a whole are becoming more expensive. Although Pokemon is getting picked on the most with how expensive games are secondhand, we can see this with a lot of classic games that were critical and commercial successes during their time that are not Pokemon. A couple of good examples of this, since they were on the same consoles that mainline Pokemon games have been on, include The Legend of Zelda Spirit Tracks on the Nintendo DS, Metroid Fusion for the Game Boy Advance, and Fire Emblem The Sacred Stones for the Game Boy Advance. What is also interesting is that all these games went up in price during the pandemic, and although the pandemic is gone, these prices are not. Naturally, you'd think they would be, but I think retro games were going this direction anyways, and the pandemic only sped it up. Overall, when we look at the bigger picture here, it is evident that this trajectory isn't going to slow down for Pokemon or retro games in general. I specifically want to point out that we see this happening with popular games. Popular games that are good and are popular because they are just that good. What I'm trying to assert here is that mainline Pokemon games are just that good, and the better the game, the higher the prices in the second-hand market. There are quite a few notable trends to point out here as well. Each mainline Pokemon games falls into one of the three categories where it is either a new entry in the generation with a totally new region, a remake, or a third version that is essentially the enhanced version of the new entry and is essentially the definitive way to play it, as it fixes a lot of problems that were prevalent in the new entry games, like what Platinum did for Diamond and Pearl. We can see that new entries tend to be the cheapest, while the third version and remakes are notably more expensive. A big factor of this is for sure the quality of the games and how good they are, but it is also, interestingly enough, the supply of them as well. New entry Pokemon games have generally sold better than the remakes and third versions by quite a margin. What this ultimately means is that there are less remakes and third versions or sequels to go around in the second-hand market compared to the new entry mainline Pokemon games. An expensive combo for sure. There is no doubt, with these absurd prices in mind, that alternatives to buying physical copies of these games have been considered. I, however, argue that they are neither a solution to this problem, nor are they even a good way to play the games. Emulation can be great, but in this case has quite a few limitations. I note this specifically for Pokemon games from Generation 4 to Generation 5. These games were on the Nintendo DS, which has unique hardware. There are many aspects of the DS and these games that make playing them a unique experience and as a result difficult to emulate. It's not easy to capture the touch screen and the dual screen features with emulation. There is also no way to go online with emulation either. In fact, for all the older Pokemon games, you miss out on one of the biggest aspects of Pokemon when emulating, which would be trading. Without rigging the emulation, there are a lot of Pokemon you won't be able to get in your Pokemon adventure when emulating, and a lot of Pokemon you won't be able to evolve as well. You also won't be able to transfer Pokemon from previous generations to new ones, such as Gen 3 to Gen 4. There's something special about reuniting with your old friends in a new adventure. With these factors in mind, it is quite evident that emulation won't give the authentic Pokemon experience. You're essentially getting a nerfed version of these games, and for a lot of fans, these features are vital to their Pokemon adventure. Remakes have been a thing of mainline Pokemon games for nearly 2 decades now. In a lot of ways, they can be excellent for newcomers to get exposed to older generations of Pokemon games, and they would only have to pay the retail price for them. But man, have you seen Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl? Although they were commercial successes, they received poor reception from fans, including myself, due to the games being glitchy, overly faithful to the original games when it came to the flaws, and feeling like a poor imitation of Pokemon rather than the real thing. Normally, a remake can be a definitive way to experience a Pokemon adventure for that region, such as Omega Ruby Alpha Sapphire for Hoenn, but Pokemon Platinum still stands tall as a definitive way to experience an adventure in the Sinnoh region, and it is not even close. In spite of these remakes and the fact that they are still cheaper than other Generation 4 Pokemon games, the original Pokemon Diamond and Pokemon Pearl games for DS are still being sold for more than what they had retailed for. I wouldn't necessarily say their prices are crazy, but they are still too high. In fact, even if the remakes were good, I doubt it would lower the prices we are seeing by much. This is evident when we look at the prices for Pokemon Ruby and Pokemon Sapphire, which in spite of receiving excellent remakes through Pokemon Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, are still going for prices well beyond what they had retailed for, and are even somewhat close to the prices for Pokemon Fire Red and Leaf Green. There are heavy rumors of a Generation 5 remake being in the works, but as we can see, there is no point in being excited about it. Another alternative that may happen but likely will not is if Nintendo were to make all the older games available on Nintendo Switch Online. They are already putting Game Boy Advance games on there and may even one day bring DS games over, so it is worth considering. The reason I find this unlikely, however, is because they could make so much more money by making and selling crappy remakes such as Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl at full price rather than making the original games available to an online service that you are likely already subscribed to anyways. I can't necessarily completely rule out the possibility though, considering that they did release all the Generation 1 and Generation 2 Pokemon games on the 3DS eShop, but I don't recommend getting your hopes up on this one. Even in the unlikely chance that Nintendo were to make these games playable through a Nintendo Switch Online membership, it would not be as good as the real experience. Similar to emulation, you will not be playing on the original hardware the games were made for, which will naturally nerf the experience. You also won't be able to trade between the games on their service. Best case scenario, they let you transfer Pokemon from the older games on their online service to the newer games, like what they did with the 3DS when Generation 1 and Generation 2 Pokemon games were made available on the eShop, and players were able to send their Pokemon over to Generation 6 games via Pokemon Bank. Now that we have looked up the factors that drive the demand and considered the current supply of these games, along with what the supply will look like as time passes, it is clear that it is only going to get worse rather than better. My advice for anyone that wants these games is to get them now rather than later. The longer you put off buying them, the more you will have to pay. For anyone that is looking to sell, now is a great time to make some good cash. I do, however, think that holding on to them for longer is a smart investment that will net more profit. But yeah, you're totally a terrible person for exploiting someone's childhood desire for owning them all. In conclusion, it was wrong and naive for anyone to think that these games weren't going to skyrocket in value. It was easy to think the pandemic caused a temporary surge in the prices of these games, but the reality is that the pandemic just further accelerated these prices to the direction they were already heading. The prices were already going up, and instead of seeing these kinds of prices 10 or 20 years from now, we are seeing them now in the present instead. I wish anyone that wants these games so they can play them all the best, as what childhood can be complete without a good Pokemon adventure. Thanks so much for watching. Do not forget to like and subscribe.